Hello, dear friends, and welcome to Parshat Pinchas. As I mentioned a few times, there's always a connection between the haftara, what we read from the prophets, and the weekly portion. And sometimes there is a double connection between the haftara and the weekly portion. So in part one, I'm going to talk about the first connection, which is the one that people see most obviously between what we read in the prophets. And then I'll talk about the second connection. So connection number one, of course, is the fact that this week's parsha, Pinchas, talks about the action of Pinchas, which is an action of zealousness, of, you might say, extremism. Because Pinchas, in last week's parsha, he saw Zimri ben Salu. It says that there was a man from Israel, Zimri ben Salu, and he had an illicit relationship with a Midianite woman, Kozbi Batsur. And it was right in front of Moshe. And Pinchas, the son of Elazar, grandson of Aaron, came and he killed them both before Moses. And it says the plague stopped, but 40,000 people were killed in the plague. Now, this is a complicated story. Yes, there was two things happening according to the Mefarshim here. There was both prohibited sexual relations with these women who were trying, of course, to entice the men, and then to, according to the Midrash, to bring them to give praise to their foreign gods. So it's also a mixture of idolatry and these illicit relations. But the act of Pinchas, I think, is an act that troubled the rabbis. Obviously, according to the text, it was something which was the right thing to do at the right time. He wanted to make a point. He wanted to stop what was going on. He also wanted to stop the plague that there was punishing the people. And so by picking out the two most obvious people, the ones who I guess even had the audacity to do it right in front of Moses, was a way of stopping this. There are some discussions in the Talmud about this too, that it says when this type of an intermarriage, when it happens, this type of sexual relation, when it is known, it says kanaim pogimbo. In certain cases, a zealot can be authorized to do such a thing, but this is not a law which is taught. Halacha ve'en morim ken. But the Talmud goes further to say that Pinchas was the head of Sanhedrin. They give him a position of being the head of the court, which would be, of course, at that time, the court of the 70 elders, which means that he had a certain authority, so he wasn't an anybody. Because again, the rabbis were bothered the way people could understand this. I mean, the simplest answer is that this was something which was a whole unusual scenario. Even the punishment, divine punishment, obviously showed that what was going on was wrong, but even without the divine punishment, of course, it was wrong. The only question is, what do you do to stop it? And obviously, Pinchas's act, which was a drastic act that he took, but I guess was necessary at the time, was an act that stopped it. And then it says, God says in this week's parsha, I'm giving him my covenant of peace, which means from now on, I don't want these acts to happen, but it was the right thing at the right time because of the unusual situation which had occurred. There are always people who want to take the law into their hands. And the Talmud does not encourage that. And if anything, it discourages that and doesn't really allow it. We have laws, even our laws themselves, when it comes to capital punishment, the Talmud is very careful in those issues. It says, Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Tarfon, that the Mishnah says in Makot, that if a court would give the death penalty once in 7 years, it was considered a terroristic court. So the death penalty was something which was discouraged. And Rabbi Tarfon said, if we were always members of the Sanhedrin, or at least members at the time that there was capital punishment, we would have never allowed it to happen. We would have figured out a way that it could never happen. Remember, the death penalty is a deterrent. It cannot be a constant punishment. Because if you're constantly killing people, that's not a deterrent. The fact that you have such a deterrent, and it's very rare, that means it's a deterrent. Famous statement of Shimon Bar Yochai in the Yerushalmi, where he says, thank goodness that in our days, there's no capital punishment for the Sanhedrin, meaning cannot give out capital punishment because there was too much homicides to deal with. And once it's capital punishment is not a deterrent, it doesn't help. Now the haftara brings a story of another zealous person who was Elijah, Eliyahu. According to our tradition, he was also a Kohen, by the way. I'd like to read the story, and this is the first connection. In fact, there's the Talmud says that Pinchas hu Eliyahu, and the Midrash seems to make this connection, that somehow there's an identification between Pinchas and Eliyahu, the two people who do what I would call unusual, or let's say, acts out of possibly despair or an unusual, an extreme situation in acts of zealousness. But let me first read the story about Elijah and the prophets and try to understand it. The hand of God was on Elijah, and he ran before Achav, the king of Israel. And it was told to Izebel everything that Elijah did, because Elijah had killed the prophets of the Baal. He killed the prophets of the idol worship. And etc. I'm going to now. Izebel wants to kill now Elijah, and he runs off to the desert. It says that as he goes to it says that he first ate, and he goes out into the desert. He ate some type of a meal and water, and then he lies down, and then he goes out for 40 days and 40 nights until mountain of Horeb, which I'll talk about in the second part. And when he comes there, God says to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And he says, "Well, I was zealous for God. And because your people of Israel has left your covenant." Of course, he's the prophet of the northern kingdom of Israel. "And they destroyed your altars, and they killed your prophets. And I am the only one left, and they want to do the same to me." So God says to Eliyahu, "Okay, stand on the mountain, and as I'm about to pass, and God is about to pass, and there is a great wind, and it makes a great sound, almost like a sound that sounds like it's destroying the rocks, but God is not in the wind. And after the wind, there's a great earthquake, but God is not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, there is a fire, but God is not in the fire. And after that, there is a still silence." And when Elijah hears that there's a still silence, he covers his face with his aderet, which is his garment. And he stands at the entrance of this cave, and he hears a voice, and it's the voice of God. And again, God says to Elijah, "What are you doing here?" Meaning, the first time you gave the wrong answer. Now I want you to give the right answer. And Elijah says, "What do you mean? I kanokineti lashem. I am zealous for God, because your people has left you, and they've destroyed the altars, and they've killed the prophets, and I'm the only one left, and they want to kill me too." He says exactly the same thing he said the first time. Why was it the wrong answer? Because God wants the prophet to defend the people, not to badmouth them. So God says, okay, Shuv l'darkecha, go back on your path to the desert of Damascus and make Chazael, the king of Damascus, and make Yehu ben Nimshi, the king of Israel. And I want you also to appoint Elisha, the son of Shaphat, from Mecholah, as a Navi, as a prophet, instead of you. Meaning you missed the point. And that's what he does. He makes Elisha the prophet instead of him. And then if you remember the story, after Elisha is the prophet, Eliyahu walks into the desert and Elisha is with him. And there is this fiery chariot that takes him up into the heavens, because that was the life of Eliyahu. He was a fiery prophet. He didn't mess around, if you want to put it that way. And even though he was a lover of his people, but he tried to create a situation by just showing them the right and wrong in a way of fire brimstone that they were not able, I guess, to deal with. And he didn't win over their hearts. Even when he had that famous showdown on Mount Carmel with 400 prophets of the Baal, and he said, you do whatever you do, and we'll have a showdown, and we'll see who gets the fire from the heaven. You'll call out to the Baal first, and then if you're not successful, I'll do it. And so the prophets of the Baal start, and they call out to their gods, and they cut themselves in order to get into some ecstasy. And they say, Baal, why don't you answer us? Answer us. And as the afternoon, the sun starts crossing the middle of the sky, and Elijah says, okay, maybe shout out how louder, I guess he can't hear. And then finally, as it's into the afternoon, Eliyahu says, enough, now it's my turn. So everybody agrees it's his turn. He rebuilds the altar of God, and he asks them to pour water on the altar and to make a ta'ala, a sort of furrow around it, to fill it up, to dug out and fill it up with water. And then he brings an animal, and he says, God, you have to show these people that you're the God, because they don't seem to get it. And then a fire comes out of the heavens, and it devours not only the offering, but the water, and all the people bow down. They say, God is the only God. God is the only God. But you know, when it's just fire and brimstone and people don't really understand what's happening, probably the next day they go back to what they're used to doing. So I'm not sure the showdown worked. Maybe it did for some. Elisha then has to be the prophet of the people. Somebody who's going to have an influence on the people to get them closer to where they're supposed to be going. Why is this brought in this first part? To show that in the end of the day, it is not the fire and brimstone man. It's not the one who is zealous, who is going to change the day. Pinchas can solve a problem at a moment, which means a specific problem in a specific, unusual situation could possibly be solved by a Pinchas, even though that might not be the preferred way of doing so. But it's never a long-term solution. If you want to reach the people, you have to educate them, you also have to set example, and you have to teach them how these things are going to give meaning to their lives. It's not by the fire and brimstone. And then that is connection between the story of Elijah and the story of Pinchas. But there is a second meaning to this haftara that I'd like to mention as well. The second meaning is the relationship between Eliyahu and Moses. Now, Moses was the opposite of Elijah. If Moses was a zealous one, who basically criticized before God the whole Jewish people, Moses was the opposite. Moses was constantly defending them. You want to do something to them? Take me out of your book. I don't want to be part of it. God said, what do you mean? I'll smite them. I'll make you into a great nation. Moses didn't want to hear about it. Didn't interest him. So in that sense, Moses was the opposite. But there was one issue, one dimension, which they were the same. And I'll explain it now. First of all, it's hinted to in the same haftara. If you look in the haftara again, and the same story I just read, we have here again Elijah running away from Izebel. And the angel says to him, eat. And he eats this meal and this water. And then after that, he lies down. And then the angel says to him, okay, now start to walk. And with that meal, he was able to walk for 40 days and 40 nights. Just like Moses, 40 days and 40 nights at Mount Sinai. Until he came to the mountain of Horeb, which was Mount Sinai, where they received the Torah. Horeb is also where the burning bush was for Moses. And he goes there and he goes into a cave, and God reveals himself to Elijah at the cave, just like God revealed his 13 principles of mercy before Moses, when Moses said, show me your countenance, and God said, I can't show you my face, I can only show you from the back. And he put Moses in Nikrat Asur, which means sort of like a cut in the rock, a cleft in the rock, he had to put it in. So there's an interesting parallel here between Elijah and Moses. There's one other parallel. Elijah was a man by himself. Moses also was somebody who liked doing things by himself. He didn't necessarily delegate. It's Yitro, his father-in-law, said to him, you can't judge the people from morning to night. You have to delegate. You have to get 70 elders, which he did. But by himself, he was sort of aloof from the people. Just like Eliyahu was a man by himself. So despite the differences between them, there's a very unusual similarity. And the similarity is this. The whole situation in the desert of leaving Egypt and then going through the desert for 40 years before coming into the promised land of Israel was an unusual, unnatural situation. Moses says in Devarim, Simlatcha lo valta me'alecha v'raglecha lo batzeka ze 40 shana. Your clothing didn't go bad, never had to be washed for 40 years. Your feet, with all the walking, never got a blister. You ate manna, which fell from the sky. You had the quails, a slav, in the evening. Everything was unnatural and miraculous in the desert. You would fight a battle. Moses would raise his hand and you win the battle with Sichon and Amalek. And everybody would come back in one piece with Sichon and Og. You would go around Jericho, because that's later already with Joshua, but let's keep it Moses. So the point is, this is an unnatural situation. Moses was the person of choice, the leader of choice for this unnatural situation. Moses was a very unusual leader. His abilities were not such that you would find among other leaders, not only in his level of prophecy, where he was in a category by himself, but the very fact that he was able to constantly do miracle after miracle in the desert through God's supervision. This was very unusual. That's not the point. That's not the long-term goal of the Jewish people. The long-term goal is that they go into the land, and in the land, they are going to have a regular leadership with regular leaders and people, and bring the Torah into the natural world, into history, and be a light unto the nations, but first and foremost, to start with themselves, of course, before you can become a light unto the nations. So after the story of Pinchas, And then after the daughters of Slofchad turn to Moses and say to him, talk to him about the land, we hear the story where God says to Moses, right after the story of the daughters of Slofchad, says, Moses, go up to the Mount of Avarim, look at the land that I'm giving to the people of Israel. You'll take a look, and then I am going to take you away. Just like I took away Aaron, your brother. He gives a reason, but basically Moses has to be taken away. Next week's parsha, he gives Moses one last task to beat the Midianites and says, after that, I'll take you away. And then Moses understands exactly what's going on. And he says, okay, may the God of all spirit and all flesh put upon the people of Israel a man, somebody who can go out before them and bring them so that the assembly of God shall not be like sheep without a pastor, without a shepherd. But Moses uses that term ish alayda, a man. Remember, David calls Moses Tfilah Moshe ish Elohim, a prayer of Moses, the man of God. Moses realizes he's in a different category. Moses says, I think if they're going to the land, they need a regular man with leadership qualities to stand over them. Ish al-Haida, a very important term here. Because Moses' whole episode with the Jewish people for the last 40 years of his life, from when he stands before Pharaoh at the age of 80 until he dies as 120, is a totally miraculous episode at the beginning of the national life of the Jewish people as they emerge from Egypt as a nation. Very, very miraculous. And this is just an episode to get them going because it was an unusual scenario. God had to grab them out of Egypt and with 10 plagues and splitting the Red Sea, all different things that went against nature. And the whole time that they resided in the desert was also by miracle. So this cannot be a permanent situation. Even if it lasted for 40 years, it had to stop. And God says to Moses, this is the time, it has to stop. Moses understands. He says, just make sure, please, that they have a leader who can now lead them in the next phase of the nationhood. And that person was Joshua, who was going to take them in the land as a natural leader. He starts off with certain miracles like crossing the Jordan and Jericho, but after that, he battles with them in a natural way over the 31 kings in the land of Israel. So, in that sense, there's a certain relationship between Elijah and Moses. Both of them are very unusual, miraculous type of individuals. Elijah even ascends the heavens in a fiery chariot. Moses is living in an episode which is an aberration, which is not a normal way for the people to live in this world. So in that sense, the death of Moses, which is talked about in this week's parsha, sort of parallels the episode of Elijah, which was needed at a point of time in the northern kingdom of Israel, but then to really solve the problem in the long term, it would have to be a man like Elisha to do so. But unfortunately, long term, we all know that the northern kingdom did not survive. They were all exiled in 722 before the Common Era. But the southern kingdom did. But I'm just saying, in my opinion, there's a second parallel going on, what I call an unusual scenario. So Pinchas was an unusual scenario. And something drastic happened. In the whole miraculous story of the desert, it was an unusual scenario, and therefore also people were punished very heavily for things that they did, which wouldn't have been so in the land. And Elijah also a lot of things that he did were very unusual types of miracles in order to prove a certain point. So this is my point, that sometimes the leadership of Moses was a leadership that had to be in the desert, but could not continue into the land. To try to understand this a little bit, but in a very different way, we probably know that many leaders who were very successful during military operations, like Winston Churchill, were voted out of government right after the war because people were afraid that they were good in the unusual situation. Are they actually good in the regular situation too? This even happened in Israel with David Ben-Gurion, who was voted out of his own party and had to create another party called Rafi in order to get back into politics. So there is sometimes that fear. Here, the fear was unnecessary because God had created Moses in had helped Moses create a type of leadership which he needed in those 40 years. But the plan was not that Moses continue into the land, because the plan was to have a natural existence in the land according to the natural course of things. Shalom, shalom.